When we talk about literature into film, we're talking about literature that's adapted into cinema, and we're also talking about films written by important writers. And the whole field of ephemera is a rich one for these films. There's posters, there's lobby cards, there's photographs, and they all show you something about these people's works.
Sometimes Hollywood has gone to great lengths to make a picture based on a great novel and failed. In fact, it seems like sometimes the greater the novel, the bigger a disaster the film turns out to be. In other cases, Hollywood buys a property for a relatively unknown book and turns it into something people consider a masterpiece.
With some of the authors, you find there are adaptations of their works, but they also wrote screenplays. For example, Chandler. Chandler wrote some important screenplays, and of course there are other important ones adapted from his works.
There are cases, however, where a film is made from a well-known or a great piece of literature, and the film evokes the novel in every way and becomes just as much a classic as the novel itself. Good examples would be The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, or The Postman Always Rings Twice by James M. Cain.
In some cases, the authors were both screenwriters and novelists and had their works adapted. It was true for Chandler. It was true for James Cain, who wrote some screenplays early in his career and then had a large number of his works adapted. Some other people like Cornell Woolridge, we mostly think of him for the adaptations from his books and his stories.
A lot of the great authors of the first half of the 20th century made the trek to Hollywood. Some liked it and some didn't, but the result was that there was a big confluence of events where many of these authors would be adapting one another's work. After the success that Howard Hawks had with To Have and Have Not, a film that was adapted to the screen by William Faulkner, Hawks called Faulkner in again to adapt his next film with Bogart and Bacall, which was The Big Sleep. And Hawks found the screenplay to be a bit turgid and wound up calling in Lee Brackett, who was a science fiction and pulp writer, to rewrite the screenplay that Faulkner had turned in, and the result was an amazing film. But when you step back and take a look at it, it's kind of fascinating, because here you have a book of hard-boiled fiction that was adapted by a writer of Gothic Southern literature and revised by a science fiction pulp writer.
These are lobby cards from an obscure lost silent film called The Chorus Girls' Romance, 1920. It wouldn't be of great importance except for the fact it's an adaptation from F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's from a Saturday Evening Post story he'd written when he was in the early 20s. He was still only 23. The film is lost long ago. And these lobby cards are basically the only trace we have left of this. These were not printed in color, they were printed in black and white, and there were actually watercolorists hired to color these things by hand.
Raymond Chandler had some success as a screenwriter, starting with Double Indemnity, which he very famously adapted to the screen from James M. Cain's novel with Billy Wilder. In '51, was hired by Alfred Hitchcock to write a screenplay for Patricia Highsmith's first novel, Strangers on a Train. This is Raymond Chandler's original corrected typescript for Strangers on a Train. It's an unusual and nearly unique screenplay in that, since it was written outside Hollywood, Chandler did it entirely on his own. And as you can see here in the screenplay, there are entire pages that are devoted to Chandler asking questions to Hitchcock about things that are not making sense in the script in terms of character development and the trajectory of certain situations and certain characters. Chandler actually wrote his name right at the top here and was kind enough for all of us later on in time to have written R. Chandler Original at the top right corner. The screenplay was ultimately rewritten by Shenzi Ormond from Ben Heck's office, but a lot of Chandler's script remained.
With Strangers on a Train, you have the first novel of Highsmith adapted to the screen. You have a screenplay partially written by Raymond Chandler, and you have one of the classics of Alfred Hitchcock. But in general, the American posters for the film are very so-so. The one exception is this extraordinary Stan D poster, and this appears to be the only known copy. This is one of the great Patricia Highsmith posters, and it's for the Purple Noon 1959 Place Soleil, which is the original version of Talented Mr. Ripley. And it's actually a male pinup poster, one of the great ones. The catch is you're looking at an artwork of a psychopathic murderer.
Readers have always anxiously anticipated the film adaptations of their favorite books. In 1939, it was Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. Oz had been written 40 years before, as the prologue to the movie tells us, and the fans were eagerly anticipating what MGM would do with L. Frank Baum's book. And what they did was made it into a musical, which became the format of our modern day musical, and they were pretty faithful to the story and to the characters. Amongst the most collectible items now for The Wizard of Oz are the stills. MGM issued them in a variety of sizes and paper types. Quite often the 8x10s were sent to magazines and newspapers. For this particular film, very few behind-the-scenes stills were taken because they wanted to keep the movie-making process a mystery. So behind-the-scenes stills on Wizard of Oz are particularly rare.
Posters from the 1942 adaptation of Glass Key have always been really rare. This is the portrait card of a very sultry Veronica Lake, and this is one of the nicest, sexiest images of her I've ever seen. This is something I'm very proud of. It's original screenplay for L.A. Confidential. So here's the autograph of director Curtis Hanson. Here's the signature of Brian Helgeland, who won the Oscar for Best Screenplay. And here's the autograph of James Ellroy, who wrote the book. One of the many surprises is that some of the screenplays of the last 20 years are actually more rare than screenplays of the 30s and 40s. They just never turn up. So you can find a script like this, and it could be a tremendously rare piece.